Hi there. Hope you and your families are all fine and ready for this week's lesson. Today we'll be focusing on the underpinnings of the concept of a strategic reader. We will focus on the development of the strategic reader rather than strategies themselves. That is what we covered actually in our last video. What we mean by the strategic reader is a reader who automatically and routinely applies the combinations of effective and appropriate strategies depending on reader goals and the tasks and the strategic processing abilities. This is what we know as the strategic reader. There are some major issues as we are talking about strategic reader. Remember in our previous video we introduced some reading strategies as a major means for building effective main idea comprehension. A number of individual strategies were introduced because of their effectiveness in supporting comprehension. It was also noted that these strategies are better learned as part of the process of reading and reading comprehension through interactions about and around text rather than creating separate sets of activities for learning and practicing each discrete strategy. As I mentioned earlier, in this video I'll focus on the development of the strategic reader rather than strategies themselves. The strategic reader is one who automatically, as I said, applies a combination of effective and appropriate strategies, not only one single strategy. And all these things depend on what your goal is, what that reading task is, and what strategic processing abilities you have. A strategic reader is also aware of his or her comprehension effectiveness, and that happens in relation to the reading goals. And then, as a result of that, applies a set of strategies, appropriate strategies, better say, to enhance comprehension of difficult texts. Okay, before exploring the advances made maybe toward developing strategic readers, it's necessary to address three major issues surrounding strategy. Actually, next week I'll be telling you about some of these strategies that you can use as you're reading, but right now, this week we will be focusing on the major issues that we need to cover. These are the three major issues. One, we are going to learn about the relationship between skills and strategies. The second one, the relationship between metacognition and strategies. And finally, the role of metalinguistic awareness in comprehension. Okay, the first of these major issues is the relationship between skills and strategies. Now, before I go ahead, I would like you to pause the video now and tell yourself what the difference between a skill and a strategy is. Okay, I hope you've answered the question. Various points of view exist on the relationship between these two, skills and strategies. In many cases, what is a strategy and what is a skill is not clear. And there is likely to be less of a difference between the two concepts than a number of researchers have argued. Though one distinction between the two seems to matter very much. And these two are obviously two adjectives, intentional and automatic. Now again, pause the video, say which do you think or both maybe, can be used for skills or strategies. Are skills intentional and automatic, or are strategies intentional and automatic? Okay. Again, I hope you've answered the question. Now, what does this mean? Anderson claims that a skill is a strategy that has become automatic. The goal of explicit strategy instruction to move readers from conscious control of reading strategies to unconscious use of reading skills. So, in a sense, when we are learning, we don't learn the skill, we learn the strategy. But if we use it masterfully, actually we have turned that strategy into a skill. Now, this perspective allows some room for distinguishing skills and strategies maybe, and it recognizes that some strategies can be controlled as conscious applications for the understanding of difficult texts. In other words, if you're reading a difficult text, you will know what strategy you are using. So you can see, obviously, repeated practice can lead to expertise and unconscious comprehension of a reading passage. The many automatized processes in word recognition can be seen as skills. Including phonological processing or orthographic processing. What we mean by the orthographic processing is your ability to read. For example, right now you just see on the screen the relationship between skills and strategies. You use this skill of yours, that is knowing this correspondence between the sound and the letter as it appears. You don't think about it anymore. It's non-conscious or unconscious. There are some other things like lexical access, for example. When you're speaking, you don't have to think that much when you're using many of the words that you are using, or when you're reading, you don't think about the meaning of the words or which meaning applies in this context or next. So right now, for instance, when you're listening to me, do you worry about every word I use? Obviously not. So it means you have become automatic. So that is a skill that you have developed. But the question is, how have you done so? Can you say your efforts and the amount of practice you put there? Definitely. Conscious attention is needed for the first registration of new information. So if I'm giving you new information, you need some attention, conscious attention. But then as you become more and more proficient, you don't need to pay that conscious attention to that. So in a sense, that information later becomes available from memory when the input is repeated and practiced, thereby becoming maybe open to what Anderson again calls proceduralization and automaticity. Strategies are commonly defined more simply as processes that are consciously controlled by readers to solve reading problems. However, this interpretation does not adequately capture what the fluent reader does while reading. First, it should be evident on reflection that many skills were originally learned explicitly as processes to address problems. To take obvious examples, we can just say anyone who has learned to drive a car or ride a bicycle as an adult knows that automatic skills begin as highly focused attentional processes. I mean, God, you can now, if you know how to drive, of course, you know that you don't have to pay a lot of attention, but as you were practicing, you had to have all your attention, undivided attention on that. In a sense, after a while, something like driving becomes so automatic that you start doing some other stuff while driving, like talking on the phone or even texting, which I do not recommend. Second, the processes that are generally labeled as strategies are often employed in a non-conscious way. For instance, you evaluate a text or even the writer as you're reading the passage, but you don't do it consciously, or do you? When you're reading a passage, you form some ideas about the writer, and you do that without even noticing it. One final thing is that strategies are often applied in combinations because those combinations have been reasonably successful thousands of times in your past experiences. Now, these combinations, and I'm going to show you these in a minute, these combinations like previewing, predicting, skipping words, inferencing, skimming ahead, reading a sentence, mentally summarizing, all these become default habits of good readers, and you don't necessarily do them consciously. The next issue we have is the relationship between metacognition and strategies. Metacognition, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, refers to the knowledge and control that we have over our cognitive processes. In other words, metacognition means knowing about knowing, or your knowledge about knowledge. With respect to reading, it's common to talk about two things: metacognitive awareness and metacognitive regulation. Metacognitive awareness is what we know, and metacognitive regulation, or maybe easier to say metacognitive control, is knowing when, where, and how to use strategies. That is what we can do. On a general level, metacognition involves awareness and control of planning, monitoring, repairing, revising, summarizing, and evaluating. And essentially, we can say that we become aware of our comprehension processing. More specifically, we can learn strategies that support our comprehension, our awareness of strategies, and we learn how to carry out these strategies effectively, that is, our control of the strategies. So on one level is knowing, awareness, and on the next level it is controlling, knowing which one to use when. Strategies have often been defined on two levels: cognitive and metacognitive. Cognitive strategies have commonly been described as strategies that the reader is trained to use, such as you can see here, guessing from context, or noting the discourse organization, or recognizing a transition phase. Sometimes skipping a word as you're reading a passage. When you don't know a word, you might just forget about it and skip it. That's a cognitive strategy you're using. Or what we learned in our previous videos about identifying a known word part. Now, guessing meaning from context, guessing meaning using the structural clues or the root of the words. All of these things, plus things like forming a question about the author, maybe, and identifying a main idea. These are all cognitive strategies, and we have talked about some of these strategies, and next week, for the next video, I'll be discussing some more of those as well. Metacognitive strategies have been described as strategies that require an explicit awareness of reading itself, and that most strongly supports the goals of reading. For example, learning to monitor comprehension might be considered a metacognitive strategy in that it requires a conscious recognition of comprehension or miscomprehension, or a need to maintain comprehension. Imagine you're reading a passage and you are reading a paragraph there and you don't understand that paragraph. your decision to go back and reread that paragraph, start all over again, is your metacognitive strategy, or a metacognitive strategy you're using, not a cognitive one. Similarly, intentional repairs to miscomprehension, or strategies with the intention to learn information from texts more effectively, are often seen as metacognitive strategies. Now, a number of specific strategies can be used to monitor comprehension or repair comprehension. For example, checking a factual statement. You read something, it's written about the year, for example, the Turkish Republic was established, but you're not sure, you might think that this is wrong, so you might just refer to something else. Again, this is a metacognitive strategy. Noticing a discourse signal, recognizing the organization of a text, if it is, for example, expository writing, as we discussed in our previous video, making predictions about the passage, again, as we discussed in our previous video. These are metacognitive strategies. Simply put, the reader is able to think consciously about what he or she is comprehending and what he or she can do to enhance or restore comprehension. Now, on the next slide, you can view the metacognitive processes for comprehension. Now, you can pause the video now and read these metacognitive processes. All of these processes are more or less present while we read, especially in academic context. Now, in many cases, for example, during fluent reading, we do not always focus consciously on these processes. And once again, let me repeat myself, we don't use only one or another one. We mostly use all of them. And then remember that it's not that all of them have to be present as we are doing our strategic reading. All right, our next issue is the role of metalinguistic awareness in comprehension. Now, when we are talking about metalinguistic awareness, we are talking about things maybe not at the reading level, but at a level other than the language maybe itself, as we usually think of it. Any increase in metalinguistic awareness allows learners to use a range of skills that are important for reading. Now, more aware learners are more sensitive to phonological knowledge, for example, and its relationship to orthographic knowledge. I guess I have told you previously about the connection between sounds and the letters as you can see them, right? So that is a part of your metalinguistic awareness and the role it plays in comprehension. Those people whose mother tongue use letters other than the Latin alphabet, for example, like Iranians or excuse me, or Arabs, they might have trouble in this regard. Is that right? Because they do not make this relationship, especially at lower levels, as easily as the speakers of those languages in which the orthographic system is Latin. These learners are also more aware of the properties of definitions, of various ways to understand the word meanings, of morphological word parts, and multiple meanings and ambiguities with words and word uses. They're also more aware of syntactic information and the context that this information provides for acquiring new words or additional word meanings. We can also add the disambiguation of words or the knowledge concepts in a text. Obviously they are more aware of how texts are organized and how information is presented as patterns of discourse structure. Kaplan, for example, has done something on rhetorics. He calls contrastive rhetorics, and he says, for example, that uh, in the Western world, like in, for example, England, let's say, that when they are presenting an idea, they directly go into that concept. But then maybe in Romance languages, there is a kind of zigzag movement into that concept. So obviously this will show us a discourse structure. Metalinguistic awareness is a general system that supports comprehension. Many studies have shown that metalinguistic awareness at levels of phonology, morphology, syntax, and discourse correlates with better reading comprehension. You can refer to some people like Anderson again, like Grab, like Coda, and find out more about those things. Anderson believes a major contribution of reading strategies to fluent reading is their increasing automaticity as a reader becomes more proficient. The overall developmental goal to routinize strategic processing still allows a learner to reflect consciously on a strategy when asked to do so, or when being taught the strategy. But the real goal for comprehension strategies is the use of effective strategies without continuously needing to move to a level of conscious problem solving. Aside from building efficiency in strategic processing, strategic readers know when, how, and why to use strategies effectively and recognize appropriate contexts for using effective strategies. They also engage actively in reading, read far more extensively, and have the motivation to read for longer periods of time. They use reading to seek out information relevant to their needs and interests. Strategic readers build efficiency and automaticity in strategy use for routine situations that they commonly encounter, and they have heightened levels of metacognitive and metalinguistic awareness that they can use when needed. In addition, they engage in difficult and challenging texts and tasks with sets of strategies that work well for them in combination. Well, on this note, I'm going to stop. Next week, I'll tell you about some multiple strategy instructions. But what is our assignment? For your assignment, I'll give you one reading passage and some questions. I would like you to spend no more than 90 seconds for each question. But after you answer the question, you will have to answer some other questions. Like you should say how you answered that question, how long it took you to answer that question, how you found the answer to the question, and write about the strategy you used, your own strategy actually to answer the question. For instance, you should say whether you read the whole passage or a specific part of it to answer the questions. Did you first read the whole passage? Did you do any surveying? Did you skim? What did you do? Tell me all about your strategies. And of course, your justifications for using that strategy. I mean, why did you use that strategy? Okay, that's it for this video and this week. Stay home, stay safe. Goodbye.